Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chess Books Recaptured, a periodic book review series. As you guys may have heard me tease in advance, I recorded a updated book review with Grandmaster Alex FIshbein reviewing My System. Just wanted to be clear that we're reviewing the new edition of My System, which Grandmaster FIshbein edited himself in painstaking detail, as you will see. Called the Fast Track Edition, new from Russell Enterprises. You can also get it on Forward Chess. And just wanted to be clear that the review and discussion is of that specific edition because Alex, as we discussed, did an amazing job cutting it in half and getting rid of all the useless diatribes and funky diagrams and all the stuff that made Christof Sieleki and I a bit critical of it in our prior podcast review. But now it's an eminently readable, enjoyable, modern chess book with the classic insights from Nimzowitsch. So amazing job by Alex, as you'll hear us discuss. I also wanted to thank our sponsors, Chessable.com. Somehow My System, with all of its editions and all of its history, still is not on Chessable last I checked. So maybe that will change sometime. But in the meantime, as you guys know, they have a huge library of classic courses as well as stuff for all levels, openings, middle games, end games, tactics, etc. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, be sure to use the link in the show description. Without further ado, let's get you to the recorded podcast discussing the My System Fast Track Edition with its editor, Grandmaster Alex FIshbein. This, of course, was recorded at the National Open in Las Vegas. Here it is. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a live edition of the Perpetual Chess Books Recaptured podcast. We are going to be discussing a book, and this is the first time that we're discussing a book that has already been reviewed on the podcast, but we have a new edition. And listen, if you're going to review one book twice, this is probably the one to do it. It is a classic and a lightning rod at the same time. And here to discuss it, we have the esteemed Grandmaster Alex FIshbein, who's been one of the top players in the U.S. for decades, remains a frequent competitor on the American chess circuit. He's a four-time U.S. championship participant and the Tennessee state champion. I think maybe among some other states too, right?
Yeah.
He's also an author and chess stat. His son Mitch is an NM who is also here playing. Successful career away from the board as a director in fixed income at TD Securities. And he most recently has edited this almost 100-year-old chess book. And what could be more quintessential Las Vegas than a live podcast about a 100-year-old chess book? So thank you, thank you all for coming, and welcome, Alex.
Well, Ben, thanks for that introduction. I'm very honored to be here, discuss this amazing, the Nimzowicz's amazing work.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot amazinger after your edition, I'll say, because anyone who heard my discussion with IM Christof Sieleki a couple years back, this book, when I was a kid, it was lavishly praised, almost universally. But I'm pretty old. That was around 1990 when it was one of the first chess books that I read, and it did help my chess education a lot. But when I came back to it, I was really surprised how slow of a read it was. And there are a lot of petty squabbles that were in the book. And I'm happy to report, having read Alex's newly edited edition, that all that stuff is gone. He just took out the bad stuff and left the good stuff in. It's a breezy read. It's very instructive. It's a great book, I think, especially for, say, 1300 to 1700 level, something like that. Maybe, give or take a couple hundred on either end. By the way, those of you here in the audience, how many of you have read My System in some form? Raise your hand. Okay. So chess Praxis, of course. Chess Praxis, of course, being Nimzowicz's other classic. And Alex, you're a fan of Chess Praxis, correct?
I'm a fan of anything Nimzowitsch wrote, but Praxis they're different. They're very different, in my opinion. My system, the style is similar, obviously, the exposition style and the ideas, but the Praxis is actually closer. It's interesting that Nimzowitsch was kind of formulating his ideas. It wasn't static. He was kind of changing and reviewing his ideas and revising them. And I think the Praxis is a step ahead of My System in terms of some of my ideas.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to discuss that one in a future pod. By the way, just a formatting note. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss My System for probably 20, 25 minutes, something like that. And then we'll open it up for anyone who has any questions, whether they're about My System or anything else. And then we may come back to it and we'll hit on my book a little bit towards the end. But Alex, getting back to my system, so you tell sort of the story of the genesis of this project in the foreword, and you're actually discussing it a little bit before we hit record, but we should probably start with that.
Okay. Well, for me, I think there were two books that kind of formed my chess education from day one, which was day one for me would have been I learned to play when I was 4, learned the moves. And I was already pretty serious when I was 7 or 8. I was probably around 1,300 strength or so. I read my system and my 16 memorable games. Those were my two books, probably in that order. And I read it in Russian. I grew up in Russia. I was born in the Soviet Union, 1968. And this was a time when Bobby Fischer was world champion. So anything written by Bobby Fischer would have been very popular. It was hard to get that book. And also there was this project to, they needed a new person to beat Bobby Fischer. So there was a big emphasis on just getting kids to play chess. So I grew up at a good time to grow up there as a chess player. So I read my system in Russian. I think I was 8 or 9 years old. I remember, I didn't really read much literature then. I wasn't reading, Crime and Punishment and things like that, or other Russian things, right? But this was a book that I read, and I remember even my grandmother was reading it to me while I was on summer vacation, and she didn't play any chess at all, but I just asked her to read this book to me. So for me, it was it was like a bedtime story. I found it pretty easy to read, pretty easy to understand. I didn't find it to be in any way arrogant or condescending or anything like that. Maybe it was because I was a little kid. All these arguments with Tarash and all these explanations of how he came up with his system, the historical stuff, for me was I didn't really understand any of that, so I kind of skipped by. But the thing that stuck in my mind, he has a lot of, of real life. He attempts to have very vivid real life analogies to chess concepts, and they kind of stick in your mind, and I'll mention one that's kind of my favorite. It's on page 98. It's a simple position, just 5 pieces on the board. For those who are listening, it's just white has a king on c6, pawns on a2 and c7. Black has a king on c8, pawn on a7. That's it, just 5 pieces. And black is stalemated. The king is stalemated, but he still has a pawn, so the pawn can move. And the idea is if the black pawn moves 2 squares, white pawn needs to move 1 square, and then black is going to be in Zugzwang and will lose. If the black pawn, on the other hand, moves 1 square, then the white pawn moves 2 squares, and the same thing happens. Very simple kind of idea, but he brings it to life. He says, I'm just going to read what it says here. It's just a couple of paragraphs. Here begins a stirring drama. The pawn, full of energy and youthful exuberance, runs ahead with a5, but we counter with a quiet a3. It's on page 98. Thereby showing the young whippersnapper that patience is also a virtue. After a4, king d6, the game is decided. Now our pal, the a7 pawn, apologizes, asking for another chance. He tries something more modest, walking with a6 instead of running. But here we demonstrate to the hapless youngster that energy can also take you far in life. We play a4, and after a5, king d6, black again loses. So very simple, but extremely instructive example. Now, when I say very simple, I probably shouldn't say very simple, because it's actually not that simple. The idea of conserving tempi in a pawn ending, it's pretty deep, actually. But he puts it in a way that it's a very basic idea, and with this one example, he covers a very basic idea of conserving tempi in Zugzwang, which a lot of even advanced players, if they didn't read this, might not really have it as part of their native language in chess, right?
Yeah.
You read this thing, it kind of stays with you forever. And at the same time, that position happens to be a very important theoretical position as well. So with the specific position. So with one, short passage where he kind of brings the pieces to life, he kind of makes a very vivid, explanation of a very important idea, and at the same time shows a theoretical position. So that's just one example. There are many such examples of my favorite. And I think that's what's best about the book. And he in his introduction, he states that in Nimzowicz's foreword, which I reproduce here, unchanged, even though some little parts of it are no longer relevant to the fast track, but most of it is. He states that he thinks that a lot of books are written kind of in a dry style with no humor. He thinks that having humor is better. Like a good humor is better than just some dry statement, even if it's completely correct and perfect, right? That's the basics. That's the kind of the basic design of the book as originally written. And now, so I read that, everything is fine. But then when I came to the United States in 1979, at the age of 11, I started telling people. Obviously were asking me for advice. I became a master. What's your favorite book? How do I get better? I said, my system. My system. You're actually recommending kids, like teenagers, to read my system. They won't understand a word of what's in there. And I'm like, wait a minute. I mean, I read this thing when I was 9. What am I? I'm not like some kind of a genius. But then when I read the English translation, I understood what they were talking about. It seemed like the Russian translation I had was just much easier to read. Like the English, especially those old translations, are kind of dense, using words that are hard to follow sometimes, like very sophisticated language. And it's very important. He wrote the text in German, and German, as far as I know, is not his native language. His native language was native language was probably.
He was born in Latvia.
He was born in Latvia. Yeah. I think Latvia was part of the Russian Empire. He grew up in a Yiddish-speaking family. I would think that Russian and Yiddish were his two main languages when he was growing up. Russian being kind of the literary language. If he was reading literature, it would have been in Russian. I know he wrote very well in Russian because he wrote some books for the Russian audience at the time, and I have those too, and they're very well written. So I think Russian was probably his first language. He's writing in a language that's not his first language, and then you translate it to another language. Very important to have a good translation. So I kind of realized over time, and as I got older, and as my own kind of linguistic skills improved, I realized that this is kind of hard to read. So then that's when I kind of came up with the idea of these translations. They're either word for word, which is problematical for many reasons, because you can't just do a translation of German to English word for word and expect nothing to be lost in the feeling of it. Or they take out some things that they consider maybe politically incorrect or not modern enough, and then it becomes a very subtle thing, like what do you take out and what do you leave in, right? So I kind of, for a long time, I was thinking that, they're right, that the book is hard to read, and yet there's so much good in the book. You really should have a better translation. And I was thinking about it for a long time, but then, all these different translations came out in the 21st century. It's like, I'm not going to write another translation when 3 are out there already. But then when I listened to Ben's podcast with Christof.
Yeah, IM Christof Sieleki.
IM Christof Sieleki, right, known as Chess Explained. It was a book recap. I didn't expect it to be as negative as it seemed.
Christof came in hot, yeah.
Right, but it was valuable because he's German, right?
Yeah.
And he actually said in the podcast that, like, if he were to recommend it to a German person, he would actually recommend them to read it in English, because the original German was very dense, right? Very hard to understand. And then I realized that you also have chess problems with it, various problems in the analysis of variations, but that's true for every book, right? Even Fischer's book has many mistakes, but it can't. You don't want a textbook to have like mistakes in the analysis, because the reader now, in the current age, right? Everybody is armed with these computers, and they start turning on their engine, and the engine says something different, and then the reader's thinking, well, okay, what am I supposed to do? What do I believe and what do I not believe, right? And you're very confused, and at that point you need a very strong player to explain to the reader that, this is strategically correct, just the wrong maybe the slightly wrong example, or the explanation is, or one variation is slightly wrong, but the idea is correct, or yeah, this idea doesn't really work, which sometimes is the case. So that needs to be corrected as well. And then all these historical allusions, he wrote this book in 1925. He had just emigrated from Russia. He had fled, I think, if I'm not mistaken. He kind of like feigned, insanity or something and fled. Maybe I'm.
Oh yeah, there was a famous story about like he pretended there was a
something like
he
that,
thought
right?
there was a fly on his head in order to get out of.
So he just fled.
Duty.
He escaped, and a lot of he was probably from I don't know, maybe whether he was from a well-to-do family or not, but I think he was. The new communist regime was not going to be to his liking, so he fled, and he's got a lot of political things to talk about, and the original has a lot of political allusions, which are currently, like for example, you mentioned one of them about the newspaper and the agrarian party or something. Like nobody understands what that even is. So there's a lot of politically motivated, or let's say, culturally motivated. The culture is very different then. You're in a world where you just had revolution. You have between two world wars. The Nazis were coming to the Nazi and communists were both. Those two regimes were both starting to become important, right? And he's kind of living in those times. You have to be very careful because a lot of the stuff that he writes is going to be affected by that. So you got to take that out, or at least make it seem more modern, right? So that's kind of how the idea came about.
Yeah, and I had highlighted that exact metaphor that you shared about the pawn with energy, and it reminded me of The Good Things, rereading this book, because my experience with this book is it was one of the first chess books I read when I was probably about 13, and some of the stuff really did stick with me, like the 7th rank chapter in particular. So I started playing chess when I was 12. About a year later, I was playing for my school, and we were in the city championship. They had like schools would travel to other schools and play, and you would stack up the boards 1 to 4, kind of like the Olympiad, except we're kids and we're not that good at chess. And you would play against the other teams. So we had the city championship my second year. I was probably rated about 1,200. And my coach at the time did something that he never did, because I was very closely rated to a kid who was a year older, to be the 4th board on this team. So he had us play a board match to see who would get to go to the city championship. And he was teaching us through my system at the time. And he taught us the 7th ranked chapter like the week before. And unfortunately, if this were a fairy tale, I would tell you I used the 7th ranked chapter to crush the opponent. But it was actually the other way around. The kid I was playing got double rooks on the 7th and just crushed me. And when you're that age, and you're trying to get better at something, it was just heartbreaking. I was so disappointed I didn't get to play. I eventually did get revenge against that kid, and actually a few years later, probably 6 years later, I brought it up, and he didn't even remember that this happened, whereas for me it was like this traumatic event. But anyway, the combination of the 7th ranked chapter with that lived experience of then being on the receiving end was one of the things that pleasant part of my system. And obviously when I did the podcast with Christof, we talked about how I was very glad to be done by the time I got to the end of the book. But here, all the metaphors, they come much quicker because it's such a breezier read. I mean, of course, there's the passed pawn. Does anyone here have any famous quotes? It seemed, by the way, when we did a poll, it seemed like the majority of people had read my system. Can anyone think of a famous quote or analogy from my system? Chris?
Passed pawn is like a criminal that should be kept under lock and key.
Exactly, yeah, probably the most famous quote of them all. And good job projecting, Chris, for the mic. You're a pro.
And what's interesting is that he calls not just passed pawns, but almost any pawn that is liable to move. Not necessarily in that chapter, but even in that chapter, there's pawns that are not passed pawns, but they still are criminals, right?
Yeah, and then there's restrain, blockade, destroy.
Destroy, right?
Yeah, talking about isolated pawns, and passed pawns and blockades are like prep school for positional play. Was that from the prior editions?
The term prep school, I made sure that term was used still in the 1920s. He didn't. That's kind of a Americanized term, but he said something like preparation for not prep school. He said preparation for positional play.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did say that.
And when he's like rhapsodizing about the king in the endgame and how the role of the king changes, he says the monarch can't relax at home reading reports from the front lines in the endgame.
That was in there.
Yeah, another good one. So yeah, there's just it's just so much more readable. So congratulations, Alex. And I would like to hear a little bit more about your sort of triangulating with the additions, because you're in a unique position to do it. You know a bit of German, which like that's like above and beyond, the Call of Duty. But then there's all of the English translations, which, as you write about and credit, you also took a look at them to see. So,
and the Russian one, importantly, as well. And the reason the Russian was important is not only because I read it first, but also because that translation is at least claimed, we can't prove it anymore, but the claim is that he worked with the translator together. The translator there was Ilya Meiselis. He was a Russian master.
No, you're good.
He was a Russian master, but more of a kind of a literary person than he knew many languages. I think he was in charge of one of the Russian publications, like 64 and one of the other ones, and he was translating and working on it with a lot of other authors. And he did he did that Russian translation, and again, according to the Soviet introduction, Nimzowitsch kind of like blessed it, and I don't know how they were working, like by mail or whatever, because they didn't live in the same place, but that's important. And Nimzowitsch wrote a lot of things for Russian, a lot of other things kind of with the Russian reader in mind. So the Russian translation is important because as important as the English ones as reference. Not that I'm using one, or I'm starting with the original, but if something was left out of the Russian one, probably means that Nimzowitsch was okay with that being left out, because he supposedly worked on it. So all these translations are important. Again, I understand. I know German grammar reasonably well, and I know it well enough to understand that the New in Chess translation was almost precise to the original German, and it claims to be, whereas the others were not as precise. So the thing is that the first few chapters, like the first part of the book is called the Elements, they're not as dense in general. The language there is easier, better. That's where the passed pawn metaphor came from. That's where the king, I think, the king and the going to the center, that's in the endgame section, which is in that first part. It's the second part that's mostly problematical. If you just had the first part of my system, I think that people probably would not be as troubled with it, because that one doesn't have a lot of junk. The second part, which is smaller, but in many ways more important, because the first one is, some of the first part is mostly for beginners to starting out kind of intermediate people, right? Like some of those positions are very simple. The second part of the book, positional play, is very complicated. And that's where he gets into these long historical digressions. And that's where he gets into, the arguments with Tarish and other people. And the positions are also very complicated. So what I did there is that second part cannot even be called a translation. That's basically a complete the chapters aren't even the same.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Right? The chapters actually move from place to place. So I just took parts of it and kind of rewrote it but the rewrite was using his language for the most part. Sometimes not, but the second part has many changes, but it's smaller, and I think it became, some of the examples were removed because they're no longer applicable. They're not. Most of his stuff was correct, but in the second part of the book, he's going close to the edge of his comfort level. Like when you talk about overprotection, right? He kind of understood what he was talking about, but he's getting a little ahead of himself. And some of these positional concepts, like Nimzowitsch is widely known as like the master of positional play. What a lot of people don't realize is he actually started out as like what I call a wild animal. He started out as a attacking combinational player. If you read his book, How I Became a Grandmaster, which I think is available in English, I'm not sure, but he wrote it for a Russian audience. It kind of like describes his progress from beginner to grandmaster, and that's the book where he talks about how his whole debate with Tarish started, where his being enemies with Tarish started, right? He talks about how he was just a combinational player, and he didn't learn positional play until later. I think he tried to form a system, but he was getting a little ahead of himself. So I think in the second part of the book, I'm trying to kind of bring it back to, like, this is what he really knew, okay? This is where he was comfortable with, so this applies. The stuff that he was less comfortable with, like especially in the last chapter, it's called in various translation different things. Maneuvering, usually it's called. That's completely wrong, because it's not maneuvering. There's a German word, lavieren, which means it's a nautical term. When you have a boat, it's called tacking. You kind of like go one way and then the other way with the wind. I don't really understand it, but so I just called it principle of playing against two weaknesses, which is basically what it is. And I'd called changing tack, which is an expression that comes from that, as kind of what he was talking about. But that chapter is like a third of its former size, because most of his examples didn't apply. He was trying to investigate things that were so new and were complicated, not just for him, but for anybody to understand. So I kept the examples that still work today. Everything was checked with the computer. So the ideas are still there, but they're a little bit simpler and less controversial. And so the second part of the book underwent a massive revision, whereas the first part of the book is much closer to the original.
Yeah, and when I read the second part reread it a few years back, it was that part that really dragged, as I mentioned. We'll be right back with more discussion of the new edition of My System with Grandmaster Alex FIshbein. So what we'll do is we'll open it up to see if you guys have any questions in a minute or two. But just to summarize for now, and then I have a few questions we may come back to. The highest compliment I can really pay this book is, like, when I read it now, it just reads like a modern book, which is not the case with the other translations. And as I mentioned in the podcast with Christof, there's something very unusual in chess, where the idea that, like, if you ask someone for a book recommendation, the first thing they would recommend is a book that's 100 years old. And obviously there's other classics not quite as old, like Zurich 1953 and My 60 Memorable Games, which hold up. Didn't need your fast tracking as much. They hold up pretty well, and they are quite instructive. But I would even go so far as to say, like, the stuff that, like, Quality Chess is putting out and New in Chess, like, the books that have come out in the past 20 years are more instructive pound for pound than those books as well. So for this book to now sort of fit in and, like, be updated, one older book that has gained new life recently, possibly in part due to a few people praising it on Perpetual Chess as Simple Chess by Michael Stean. Very good positional primer, and this kind of fits in that mold. I still probably prefer Simple Chess just because it's an absolute classic and it's very short and very well done, but this is right there with it, and it's something I would definitely recommend. So well done, Alex.
Well, thank you very much for the compliment. I really appreciate it. One thing I should mention, because this is important, in terms of dealing with the differences between the original and the new, and how that, the important thing is, if you just write the new and the old and the new, and then every time there's a change you kind of put some kind of footnote or italic, it starts reading like it's two books, right? So I used a little device a little sneaky device, which I haven't seen used before. But when there's a variation, when there's a problem in the variation, but the idea is good, there's just a problem when the variations. I just put the correct variation in, as if he wrote it. The appendix, and then the old variation, which was not correct, is mentioned in the appendix. So if you want to go over the appendix, there's like 40 items there. They mention kind of what was there before in some cases, or sometimes they just mention, okay, he didn't have this, he didn't have this line. I just added this line, right? Because you don't want to have the whole book flooded with footnotes. Right. It just becomes a mess, right? So fortunately, he didn't have a lot of variations. He actually had many more just verbal explanations than complicated 5-10 move variations. But when they were wrong, and it was important to note that, I put in the appendix. Now, in a few cases, there is a big difference in the whole, the whole theme doesn't really work, or the whole, narrative has to be amended because he was evaluating the position in a certain way it's not quite correct, which is fine, because a lot of the ideas still make sense. You don't throw the game out because many of the ideas work. It's just the narrative has to be changed. Those cases, there are about 5 or 6 of those. There I did have to add some italics. So now you kind of, in those 5 or 6 examples for the whole book, 200 pages, just maybe 5 or 6 such examples, you have kind of the old and then you have the new in italics, right? That's important to kind of keep, I was trying to keep the book kind of flowing freely so it doesn't appear like somehow like mangled.
Yeah, it's tough because
an interested reader, if you really want, and I think, but to do this, you probably have to be an advanced player as well. If you read the original, you can go back and see what changed if you want, and you can figure out, and it's very interesting to figure out how positional chess understanding changed from his time to now.
Yeah.
Like the overprotection part, some of the isolated pawn parts. I learned a lot by writing this book, actually, or rewriting this book, whatever it is, whatever you call it. My rating went about 50 points from the time that I started working on it to the time I finished working on it. I don't think it was a coincidence, because for me, all these concepts are basically second nature, as I mentioned. I read them when I was 8 or 9 years old. For me to reevaluate this adds a lot of kind of new ideas, and it's just a kind of a infusion of chess knowledge all of a sudden for me.
And you got
being
rid
a
of
grandmaster and knowing this stuff already.
And you got rid of those crazy diagrams that Christof and I couldn't understand.
Oh yeah. The schemes, right? Yeah. No, I got rid of that. And also, there's sometimes the order of things change. Like the games might be in a different order, or the games might follow directly. Like he had a lot of text and then some examples, some more text, a couple of diagrams, a couple of text, more text, pages and pages, and then illustrative games. What I'm trying to do is there's some text, and here's an illustrative game, full game, right? And here's some more text and illustrative game. So, in the hope that reads more, just kind of easier to read, right? Than having. I mean, one of those translations, I think the first one actually had all the games at the end, which is terrible. Having it at the very end, right? Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see if we have questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and then either attempt to speak loudly, or if you want to come up and ask, you're welcome to as well. And again, it can be about my system or anything else. All right, Chris.
I guess the most obvious question to ask is, does this give you any ideas? Well, I guess this question is for Alex. Does this give you any future ideas on other books that can use this treatment? I don't think there are any other as divisive as this, but there are definitely some that are really good that could use a boost.
Yeah.
Or really good.
Yeah. Well, actually, one person already mentioned, I don't want to necessarily say out loud to everybody in the world which one it is, but one person already mentioned one of the books.
I could think of one.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. If it's a tournament book, like annotated games, then no, I don't think so. Because, like, let's say Alekhine's annotations, he had many mistakes, right? Almost every game is filled with mistakes in the analysis. But the thing is, you put something through an engine. We can't just be engine monkeys, right? It's important to understand how people thought, right? And you want to keep that. You want to keep. So if you were to revise something like that, I don't know. It's as valuable. Those books, why do we even read those books? Why would we read something from the early 20th century when we can read something from the modern times where people have so much more wealth of understanding and cleaned up all the misconceptions? Because it's interesting how people thought then and how chess progressed. Like when I read those books from the 1920s, like one of my favorites is Alekhine's 1924 and 1927 tournament, New York 24 and 27 tournament books, right? What's interesting to me is I put them through an engine, and I see where he went wrong. Now, why is that interesting? Because my chess understanding is mostly based on intuition, and so were these people from the early 20th century. They didn't have technology at their disposal. Like, they were basically thinking as people, thinking more intuitively than even players now do, right? So Alekhine, and same thing goes for Capablanca, for Lasker, for Nimzowitsch, right? They're looking at the position through the lens of how you learn chess, and this is how you approach the position. Since we have gathered all of that knowledge over the last 100 years, we tend to think the same way. The humans tend to think the same way. So if I see where Alekhine went wrong, that tells me where I might have gone wrong, where I might go wrong. So if I see, for example, that he didn't seem to understand how much a bishop is stronger than a knight, let's say, and made some typical mistakes, that gives me a hint to what typical mistakes I might be making in my own chess games, because I learned from Alekhine, and people still learn from. Same thing goes for Bobby Fischer, and for, you learn from these guys. Figuring out where they went wrong is very valuable because it tells you where you're going to go wrong. So I don't know if it makes sense to revise people's annotations to games. If it's a textbook, though, then it's different, right? How many textbooks are there? This is a textbook, right? Zurich 53 is not a textbook. 16-year-old games is not a textbook. You can't have a textbook that is wrong, but to have historical document. I mean, do you want to have footnotes saying, okay, this is actually correct? Maybe there's an idea. Maybe there's an idea to kind of take some of these books and figure out what these great players would have thought now, with the benefit of the computer, but the way they approach the game. Maybe there's an idea like that.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
So, so you said that you basically had to rewrite parts of the book,
Yeah.
right? And obviously chess has progressed a lot in 100 years, and there's positional concepts that would have been left out of the original book. Did you kind of stick to what he tried to explain completely? So any of these more modern ideas,
right.
you try to bring
Nothing is added.
Gotcha.
Nothing is added. That's the idea. I don't want to. This is Nimzowicz's book. It's not FIshbein's book. Nothing is added to my system. Things got subtracted. Things got removed, but no new concepts are added. Some things were changed a little bit, like overprotection, for example, gets a new treatment. Right? It's described a little bit differently, and you can see in italics. When I'm saying something that is an important concept that Nimzowitsch did not write, and maybe would not have written even if given the opportunity with a computer, that's in italics, right? But there's not that much of it. So it sticks to the original. It doesn't add new. I mean, you can't, he says in his own foreword that, I didn't cover all the corners of, I think he says, all the corners of chess strategy. The book is going to have some flaws because it doesn't elucidate all the corners of chess strategy. But what he does have is extremely ubiquitous. It's amazing. Almost every game that you play, there's going to be a Nimzowitsch idea. I mean, many of you have probably seen this blunder that Ding blundering made in two a couple of weeks ago against Carlsen. People probably don't realize almost exact mate is in my system, except there was a rook sacrifice there instead of a queen. It just shows that these ideas just show up all the time. So are these ideas going to be enough to get you to be a grandmaster or a master? They'll take you really far because they're all ubiquitous.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
So, like when I was younger, I think a lot of the concepts that are in this, like rooks on the 7th, open files, this kind of basics, right,
Yeah.
were what I thought of as positional play.
Yeah.
And now I think of like space and different concepts. Can you maybe list some things that you would consider sort of like basics of positional play that wouldn't have made it into this because they were?
I think that wouldn't have made it at all. He does talk about space, okay. Maybe not at as much length. In the context of the positions with, if you want to talk about space, I think the best chapter would be the one on pawn chains. the pawn chain gives one side a space advantage on one side of the board. I think people didn't appreciate how strong the two bishops. There is a chapter on the two bishops, but it's very short. It was short in the original. Two bishops in the endgame, how strong they are. But he has that. He has that also. I think that prophylaxis is mentioned here, but it's only a very limited application of it, which is to prevent opponents' pawn moves. But actually, prophylactics is used for many, many things. And his next book, The Praxis, gives a little bit of an insight into that. So, like, I think Karpov in the 1970s introduced prophylactic thinking as a basic positional concept. I think Karpov's games are great to look at in that vein, to learn positional chess. Things like, I don't know if this is positional chess or not, but like attacks on opposite side castling, he has none of that, right? Pawn sacrifices for attack, right? That's a positional thing. I don't think that's attack. That's not like understanding value of material versus initiative, right? He doesn't have very much. He has a little bit of that, but that's Tal. That's Kasparov, right? I don't know. There's other things. This is not going to get you. This is not going to be everything you need. But this is, when you talk about pawn structure, this is probably the best book to read in that sense.
Any other questions? Yes.
So there's a book, I have it, but never cracked it, along with the other books I have. Sound familiar? Keene's Nimzowitsch, a Reappraisal.
Right.
Does that have any impact on what you did?
I read that book at the age of 11, and frankly, I don't remember very much. I know I read it. I was 11 years old. It was one of the first books I read when I came to this country. And I think I'm just gonna leave it at that. I think he thought that the Praxis was not as good as he thought. He found the Praxis to be like a relatively poor book versus my system. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think the Praxis was actually a very deep and interesting book. So I don't know. I'd have to reread that book again to form a more informed opinion. But I did read it a long time ago.
Is there a book, Blockade?
Yeah, the Blockade. Yeah, that's a pretty short book. Some of the Blockade is some of the games are the same. A couple of games are the same. Like for example, the Immortal Zugzwang game is in both. The one against Zamish. So that book was only like 10 games. It's pretty short. I don't think it's worthwhile. If you have this, probably don't need that. But the Praxis, I think, is worthwhile. But the Praxis is deeper, and he's starting to approach a level where people are not really going to understand until the Karpov era. So he's seeing further ahead into the future, so he's making more mistakes there, I think.
Okay. Yes.
Just a quick question. How much shorter is the fast track version than the other popular translation? Ballpark.
Half, maybe 2/3.
Okay.
Quite a bit shorter.
But we get the meat and potatoes.
Yeah. Well, the first part is the first 6-7 chapters, the elements, are probably more like 75 to 80% of it. I guess it depends on how you define it. I think about 2/3 of the games made it in. I don't know. Between half and 2/3.
Yes.
Any chance you're going to do Praxis?
Yeah, I mean,
They go well together.
yeah.
We'll have to see how many people buy this one.
Yeah, I mean, it just came out a month ago.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Praxis. Yeah, that's a deep book. Maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
So obviously the modern chess world is very different, both with the engines, but also just the ability to just play way more games than historical players ever played in their whole life. In a month or a year.
Yeah.
So I guess how would you rank the importance of still learning older foundational text and foundational theories in your training, along with just playing games? How would you,
Well,
how would you put that?
I think that
importance?
I think that the old books are good because, like, if you look at the new games by very strong players, number one, these players are much more universal. They have a universal style, right? There's no they're not as distinctive, right? So, like, if you want to have like one idea, this will give you a more clearer picture of that one idea. The new games, you're not going to have a lot of people fall into these same kinds of traps that the players in the past did. So, I mean, you should do both, obviously, but the basic, I still go back to a lot of not just this book. I read a lot of Alekhine. I read a lot of Karpov. And when I say I read, like, you may think, well, why is he reading this? He's already read it. I think this is a book that I read probably 20 or 30 times over my life.
Wow.
First I read it when I was 8 years old, then I read it probably when I was beginning to end when I was probably 12 or 13, and then I read it again beginning to end when I was like 16 or 17. I was reading 2400. And then I reread it again when I was Grandmaster, and each time I learned new things. I think the same goes for Fischer's book. I read it first when I was probably 1500. And now I constantly go back to it because almost every game that I play has something written about it, and the concepts are shared, right? The concepts are going to be written about in these old books. And these people, Bobby Fischer, for example, one of the greatest thinkers, chess thinkers, for sure, one of the greatest chess thinkers of all time. He took pains to explain everything he saw and thought about in his games very deeply, more deeply than any player before and maybe even since, in his book. You're talking about not just having an engine go through your games, but having an engine actually explain to you what is going on.
Yeah.
So you're not going to be able to understand that the same way if you're a C player or B player or A player as if you're 1200, you'll understand some things. You're 1600, you're going to understand more. You reread the same thing, you're going to get a different understanding. It's like reading Shakespeare. You're going to, every time you read it, it's going to be something else. You have other emotions, right? Or any book. These books should be read as pieces of literature, in my opinion.
Wow. Okay, well, if you guys think, you got another, Chris?
Yeah, I do have one more question. It's more of a general approach to reading books.
Yeah.
So I would imagine the most effective way to read a chess book is probably the way that no one does, which would be to play guess the move on every move and critically think about everything. So we'll sweep that under the rug and just say, from a practical standpoint, what would be the best approach to reading a chess book? Are we talking about reading the same book start to finish before you look at anything else? Are we talking about more along the lines of, just carefully playing through annotations and thinking about it? What is the most practical approach?
The most practical approach, the guess the move, I never do that with books.
Well, you're not insane, Alex.
Yeah, I do that with games, right? Games that are played, but not with books, right? I think that the most practical approach is you take a game that you've played, whether it's a win or a loss, and you try to find something similar in the literature. And you will. I guarantee you will. You will. And then you think about how these players thought about it. And that's why it's good to have, like Tal, for example. That's maybe my third favorite book, right? Fischer, this thing, are 1 and 2 in some order. Probably Fischer's 1, and this is 2. In my
The Life in Games or Tal Botvinnik?
Yeah, the Life in Games.
Okay.
The Tal Botvinnik is, I mean, that's good too, but Life in Games, because it's got it has a biographical section where he discusses things, and that's interesting. But how did he think about certain problems in chess? Bronstein is good, but he is just too wishy-washy, and that's more of a fairy tale kind of thing. If you want a fairy tale story. But these Alekhine and Tal and Karpov, for sure, are very serious thinkers, and they don't have a lot of kind of fluff in their books. So almost any game you've played is going to have, it could just be an opening. Like maybe you played an opening which you remember from some other, you can just go through and see, okay, did they play an opening like this? You're almost certain going to have, like I had a friend of mine who, former student, lost a game 3 weeks ago in a tournament. It was like a check Benoni kind of thing, and I told him, yeah, there's a tile game like this. Right? Here it is, right? Having a coach who can do that is helpful, and then you can kind of see what the, because they didn't have the engines, right? They didn't have the variations, but their positional understanding was still there. It was still very strong, right? So that's how I do it. That's how I've always done it. I don't read it beginning to end. I just read the parts that seem to be more relevant at the time.
We'll be right back with more discussion of the new edition of My System with Grandmaster Alex FIshbein. Well, if you guys think of any other questions, feel free to raise your hands. But as we start to wrap up, Alex, let's just spend a couple minutes on Perpetual Chess Improvement.
Sure, yeah.
Because I was honored that Alex actually read my book, and he's told me a few things about it. So, Alex, love it if you could share with people maybe a couple things you agreed with and a couple things you disagreed with.
First of all, great, congratulations to the book. It's a fantastic book, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Now, I'm coming from a little different perspective, right? Because most of my improvement came when I was very young, right? I don't think the book is aimed for 10-year-old kids. Right?
It's not aimed for grandmasters, for that matter, either.
Probably right.
Yeah.
So my I'm not going to have the same. I liked a lot of the advice. I really thought was very astutely written and very sharp. And I think like one thing I like the most maybe is very simple, and yet nobody else talks about it. You have to play in tournaments. If you want to improve, you have to play in serious tournaments. At least 60 games a year. Frankly, I think it should be more than that. I've already played about 60 games this year to date, 5 months, maybe close to 70, I think, with this tournament. I try to play at least 100 games a year, having a full-time job. But if you want to improve, playing in serious tournaments with long time controls, not blitz games. I mean, blitz games are important too. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that. I do that too. Play lots of blitz games also, but more than people imagine. but serious tournaments, at least an hour game time control. Why? One of the reasons that you put in the book, a very simple reason, and yet, the first time I read it is, it just forces you to be more responsible for your games, because you're not going to go to a weekend tournament or like this, a 5-day tournament. It costs thousands of dollars just to come here. I mean, it costs $1,000 just to eat here.
Just for a cup of coffee.
For a cup of coffee, right? So you're spending a lot of money. You're spending time away from your family or other things you're doing. You're going to be more serious about those 9 games or 7 games that you play. You're going to take them more seriously because you don't want to blow your vacation on something. So, and you can see that I can see the players in these tournaments tend to play better, but more serious. My opponents seem to be tougher.
Yeah.
Than in like these weekend Swisses or game 45 or something. So, playing a lot. One other thing I liked, keep things in perspective, right? Your journey is the important thing, right? It's not about like, you have to set be realistic about your goals, but the enjoyment of the process is the most important thing. The advice on openings, I think, what was it? Like, openings don't matter until you're 1500, right?
Yeah.
I think, I tend to agree with that, and I think that openings should be studied. There should be no memorization. I mean, I'm a grandmaster. I can count maybe on one hand the number of times I actually tried to memorize a line. Like, seriously, like just on one hand. Usually it's, Mitch sometimes helps me do that. Like, I think he tests me with some variation. Usually it's, I go through the lines, I put them in my notebook, I try to play speed chess games with them. I don't go down and try to memorize moves. But the ideas are much more important. Understanding, what the concepts are. What else? I mean, those.
Well,
are
any
some
disagreements?
Things. Not a lot. The only one maybe is this idea of maybe some of the books, like for example, the Dresky Endgame Manual, right?
Right. Which you have a personal relationship with, of course.
Yeah, I wrote the fast track of that too.
Yeah.
Or helped write. Is that something that, a lot of people say, well, that should be only for really strong players. Well, but I guess you don't want to, you don't want to sell yourself short ever in life and in chess also. What's wrong with reading a book that's maybe a little more complicated, but then, that's the height of chess. Maybe you'll understand some things, you'll learn some things, right? Like I wouldn't want to be, when I was 8 years old, I wouldn't want to be told, yeah, this is too complicated for you. Like, don't read it. No, I mean, you should have I don't know, it's just maybe it's a personal opinion. You should have the philosophy of, I'm willing to take on everything. Okay, this is a little bit harder, but okay. I can understand it. I can understand some of it. And then I'm not saying you should read that book cover to cover. No way, right? But nothing wrong with having that in the library as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for the kind words.
No,
and
yeah,
if we have any other questions, we can get to them. But otherwise, I think we will wrap up. But in closing, yeah, much needed. I mean, much quicker read. I think 50%, about 50%, I would say, of the time it took. I read the other versions digitally more recently, and this I read in actual paper, but it's going to be on Forward Chess, correct?
It is. I think it already is, yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually, it would be, obviously, you guys here, like, Alex is happy to sign them. It's a good reason to get a paper copy. But for people listening at home, it's a pretty good book for something like Forward Chess because there's a decent amount of actual chess.
Yeah, it's on there already, I think.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you, Alex. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for coming and for listening at home.